Hello everyone. So tonight I'll be reading out not a ghost story, a story about a witch from North Yorkshire, Anne Pearson of Gothland. Perhaps the most active witches in North Yorkshire were those of Gothland. Some families passed their witchcraft skills down from generation to generation. Anne Pearson came from one such family. Her mother and grandmother were both supposed to be witches. She lived in a decrepit cottage on the edge of the village and had the reputation of having the evil eye, an ability to harm people with a single glance. No one dared go near her hovel. Children would run away screaming, even at the mention of her name, while their parents would cross the road to avoid the old witch. As a result, Anne was a bitter and lonely old woman. It was sometime during the 19th century that Gothland's squire discovered that his daughter had fallen in love with a local farm worker. He had plans to marry her to one of his wealthy neighbours, and knowing her to be a headstrong girl, feared she would elope with the boy if he made any objection to her romance. The squire tried several ways of breaking his daughter's affection for the poor farm worker. He organised a grand ball in his house, inviting all the rich and eligible young gentlemen from miles around, hoping she would fall for one of them. He even tried to have the lad pressed into the navy, but none of these ruses worked. The squire was an educated man, and along with the other important people in the village, the doctor, the priest, the schoolmaster, etc., had always scoffed at the notion that the mad old woman who lived in the old falling down ruin at the edge of the village was a witch. So it is an indication of how desperate he was that he made his way to her cottage one evening after dark, checking behind him to make sure that no one had seen him coming. The squire knocked nervously at Anne Pearson's door. After a minute, the old woman opened it an inch or so and peered suspiciously at him. He told her he had come on business, and with one bony finger she summoned him inside. The squire looked around the single dingy room, which was her home. Feeble firelight flickered over her few sticks of rotten furniture. In a corner, a few dirty blankets lay by a heap of straw, which served as the witch's bed. At this point, the squire would have done well to consider why it was that the old woman lived in such miserable circumstances, when the ignorant villagers credited her with so many powers. But his thoughts were interrupted when the old croon demanded to know what his business was. As the squire told her that he had wanted something to stop his daughter from eloping, the old croon became excited, walking up and down the room, rubbing her hands gleefully, muttering under her breath. In one corner of the room was a little wooden chest, and from it the old woman took a little bottle filled with a pale yellow liquid. She gave this to the squire and told him to add the contents to his daughter's food. The squire thrust a few guineas into the croon's hands and made his way home by quiet paths so that no one would know where he had been. At supper that night, the squire succeeded in adding the yellow liquid to his daughter's food. The following morning, he was horrified to discover that his daughter was unlikely to elope, not because she had fallen out of love as he expected, but because she had become paralysed from the neck downwards. 2 doctors were called, but neither could find a reason for her problem, and both left, shaking their heads baffled. But the squire knew the cause, and was too ashamed to tell the doctors of his visit to the witch. After pacing the house impatiently all through the day, the squire set off, as darkness fell, to see the witch again. He hammered on her door, but she would not open it to him, so he had to beg her to take off the spell through a little chink. The witch refused, dancing up and down behind the door laughing. He offered her money, threatened to beat her, but to no avail. Finally, in despair, the squire turned to go home a broken man. Soon the girl's mysterious illness was the talk of the village, and the farm worker, hearing of it, and being from an old Gothland family, immediately suspected that the cause was witchcraft. And he knew what to do. He visited a local wise man, skilled in countering the spells of witches, and told him about the girl's symptoms. The wise man gave him some tea, and afterwards told him to look at the leaves at the bottom of the cup, and asked him if he could see a face there. When the farm worker said that he thought he could see a rough likeness of Anne Pearson, the wise man nodded his head in satisfaction. The cure for the girl's troubles, according to Wiseman, was to mix some of the witch's blood with holy water, and to rub the girl's feet with it. The farm worker went home and considered what he should do. The problem was the blood. He couldn't ask Anne Pearson for some of her blood in order to break her spell, for she would be unlikely to cooperate. And besides, counter spells only worked if done secretly. Also, if he attacked her with a knife and cut her, he would probably be sent to the gaol. Then he remembered that witches were known to turn themselves into hares occasionally, to go about causing mischief. So he armed himself with a shotgun and some holy water that very night, and slipped into a field by Anne's cottage, where he waited in the shadows patiently. At midnight, the biggest grey hare that he had ever seen appeared under Anne's hedge. Waiting for a few seconds to make sure he could not miss, the farm worker fired his gun, hitting the creature heavily in its back legs. The wounded animal, screeching in pain, dragged itself back under the edge, leaving a gory trail of blood smeared over the grass. The farm worker jumped up and gathered some of this blood on a handkerchief, then ran to his sweetheart's house. He climbed in through her bedroom window with the aid of a ladder, which he had hidden earlier. After waking the girl to tell her what he was doing, he poured some holy water onto the handkerchief and rubbed her feet. Immediately her paralysis disappeared, and she was restored to full health. And now the squire's worst fear came to pass, for the ladder was then used by the couple to elope. As for Anne Pearson, she was not seen for some days after this incident, and when eventually she did appear, she was seen to be hobbling with the aid of 2 walking sticks, bloody bandages wrapped around her hairy legs. So that's the story. Hello everyone again. So I'm reading out another story about a witch from North Yorkshire. It's called Old Catty of Ruswarp. Old Catty lived in a wonderful time for witches, for the brutal laws against witchcraft had just been repealed. But the belief in witchcraft amongst country folk was still strong. Catty made the most of her evil reputation, terrifying the local population. None dared look in the face, for they believed she had the evil eye, and could cast spells on them with a wicked glance if anyone had to talk to her. They did so in a very professional manner, cap in hand, eyes looking down to the ground. As a result, old Catty, old and smelly hag as she was, began to feel that she was rather better than her neighbours, and began to look down on them. Now one day, much to everyone's surprise, a ragged old pedlar known as Abe Rogers came to Ruswarp, walked straight into old Catty's cottage, sat in her best chair, put his feet on the table, dropped his pack on the floor, and said, "Put the kettle on, you old witch." Today we do not see many pedlars, but at that time they were common enough. They bought a few packets of pins or other cheap articles in a town, then sold them round the countryside, often telling a sad tale of misfortune to the country folk, so that in pity they would buy the goods whether they needed them or not. Pedlars often slept in hedges and were very poor. All their worldly possessions carried on a pack over their shoulder. The neighbours, forgetting for a while their fear of old Catty, gathered near the door, all peering in. They saw the old woman meekly pick up the kettle, fill it, and put it over the fire, glancing nervously now and then at the pack. Everyone expected that once it boiled, she would pour it over the pedlar's head, but were amazed when she mashed the tea and gave him a cup in her best china. Murmuring, amazed, they went home, wondering how Abe Rogers dared to treat old Catty in this way. And from their wondering and muttering, a legend grew. So, the legend of old Catty and the pedlar. Once upon a time there lived in Ruswarp a powerful witch called old Catty. Old Catty had many wonderful spells, and had as her familiars 23 huge demons to carry out her will. One day, while walking up on the hills by a tiny bridge over a little stream, over which only one person could cross at a time, she came upon a pedlar known as Abe Rogers. Old Catty thought that she, a powerful witch with 23 huge demons to carry out her will, was very much better than a mere pedlar, and although he was already on the bridge, she told him to stand aside and let her across. Abe ignored her command and carried on. The old witch jumped up onto the bridge to block his way, but the pedlar yanked her up by her collar and dumped her into the stream. Old Catty was furious. She waded to the bank and pulled out a knife, ready to cut him to pieces. He, however, simply laughed, knocked the knife out of her hand, and tripped her into a muddy patch. Old Catty, now in a crimson rage, decided to use her supernatural powers to gain revenge. She muttered a few secret words, and immediately 23 great ugly demons appeared in a circle around Abe Rogers. Catty shouted, "Don't let him get away," and the awful creatures began to advance on Abe, bearing great yellow teeth, red eyes gleaming. Old Catty rubbed her hands with glee, looking forward to seeing the upstart pedlar ripped limb from limb. The pedlar dropped his pack, but not in fear. He pulled out a little wallet, and from this wallet plucked a tiny pinch of dust, which he threw straight up into the air. Suddenly a great whirlwind appeared, spinning the dust into the demons' faces, who fell to the ground in agony, clutching at their eyes. Abe snatched up old Catty's knife, cut off the left ears of the creatures, and popped them into his pack. He knew that by having part of their flesh and blood, they could have no power over him. He picked up his pack, smiled mockingly at old Catty, and went on his way. After this, whenever he passed Ruswarp, Abe made a point of visiting old Catty and making himself at home, putting his feet up on the table and shouting, "Put the kettle on, you old witch." And he always got his tea too, for old Catty, although she was hardly pleased to be addressed in this way, was too terrified of what else might be lurking in the bottom of his pack to mutter or protest. Hello everyone. So tonight I'll be reading out a ghost story from Norfolk, called Queen Isabella's Ghost. "Are you sure you want to stay here all night?" said the keeper of Castle Rising. "By yourself with her?" Harold Collins, professional ghost hunter, smiled and said, "I've slept on Marston Moor and seen skeleton horses charge through the mist onto phantom pikemen. Heard the sound of ghostly swords clashing, men dying. I've spent the night in the very room they tortured Guy Fawkes. Seen his ghostly figure, arms stretched to 5 foot long by the rack, moaning and gibbering on the floor. I think I can manage here alone. After all, no one was ever executed here, or boiled alive." "On your own head, then," said the guide, shaking his head, and banged the heavy oak door closed behind him as he left, the sound echoing in the empty corridors. Harold Collins sat down on his little camp stool and arranged his equipment, the paraphernalia of the ghost hunter: a tape recorder, thermometer, infrared goggles, and settled down to wait for the ghost. Edward II was one of England's less successful kings. His father, Edward I, was called the Hammer of the Scots because of his enthusiasm for invading and murdering the citizens of Scotland. Edward II was not nearly so keen on this sport and preferred to spend his time with his witty friend Piers Gaveston, feasting and drinking. Edward's wife and the powerful barons were not very pleased with this sort of behaviour, for they felt it was the duty of a good king to kill foreigners in large numbers. Plots were laid to kill the Gaveston and so bring the king back to his senses. But after poor Piers was kidnapped and murdered near Warwick Castle, Edward became even more peaceful, seeking comfort for the loss of his friend by embracing religion. Isabella was disgusted and went off her husband, taking for her a lover, Hugh de Mortimer, a suitably violent man whose favourite hobby was invading Ireland. Isabella had a son also called Edward, and felt that unless her husband was deposed, her son would not grow up to be suitably vicious and cruel. So she encouraged her love, Hugh de Mortimer, to plot against her husband and topple him from the throne. Hugh was delighted with this idea, for he thought that he would then be able to manipulate Isabella and her son and so rule the kingdom. With his friend dead and his wife turned against him, Edward II had little fight left in him and signed away his right to be king when a group of barons kidnapped him. His only wish, he said, was to become a monk and dedicate his life to helping the poor, but he was locked up in Berkeley Castle, and his keepers, on instruction from Hugh de Mortimer, murdered him with a red-hot poker. Now was a happy time for Isabella and Mortimer, She was happy, for her son was crowned Edward III, and under the care of Mortimer was learning all the skills needed by a king: lying, hypocrisy, violence. Mortimer was happy because he was now the virtual ruler of England and had managed to start several wars. Things were to change, however. Mortimer was a good teacher, and Edward a quick learner. Edward had never let his mother know how angry he was that she had helped to kill his father, and Mortimer never knew that the boy's ambition was to have him killed. By flattering this man, threatening that Edward soon had a palace coup organised, seizing control from Mortimer, and locking Isabella up in Rising Castle, Mortimer fled in terror to France, but Edward was too clever for him. He wrote to his teacher begging him to come back, telling him he needed his help, promising that all was forgiven. Mortimer was flattered and returned, but no sooner had he set foot on English soil than he was arrested, tried for treason and condemned to die. On the day of his execution, Mortimer was dragged from his cell and thrown onto the ground, while a sword, specially imported from Germany, was slowly sharpened in front of him. But once it was razor sharp, no one could be found to behead him, for in those days it was held to be bad luck for commoners to spill the blood of a nobleman, and there was no one of high enough birth to do the deed. Mortimer was left kneeling with the sword glinting in the sunlight before him. Meanwhile, a courier was sent round the neighbouring countryside in search of a knight or earl willing to lop off the unfortunate baron's head, but with no success. Finally, after 5 hours, a criminal who was due to hang the following day agreed to do the chopping off if he was given a pardon. Amazingly, in the long hours which Mortimer had spent looking in terror at the fatal sword, his hair had turned white, and the head, which was stuck off, looked like that of an old and withered man. The news of this amazing transformation reached Edward, and gave him the idea of how he could best punish his mother for the death of his father. He had Mortimer's head and the sword taken to Castle Rising, with the message that Isabella must soon share her lover's fate. The sword was locked in a heavy wooden chest in Isabella's bedroom, so she would not forget her fate. Although her jailers treated her well, feeding her the best food, letting her wear her best clothes, hers was the most miserable of lives. Each time her door opened, she thought she was about to die, although it might only be a servant bringing her a glass of wine. Whenever her horseman came to the castle, she shook with fear, thinking the king had sent her death warrant. And every Sunday the blacksmith came to sharpen the sword, and the sound of his grinding wheel could be heard all over the castle. Soon Isabella could not sleep. Her eyes shrunk into her head with fear and fatigue, moaning in terror whenever she heard a noise. She began to imagine the shadows in her room to be the executioner come to kill her. The sound of birds singing, a crowd gathering to watch her death. Her hair fell out. Her head shrunk down beneath her shoulders, as if trying to hide her vulnerable neck. Her clothes fell to rags, but she would have no new ones, thinking the tailor was measuring her for a coffin. After 5 dreadful years, Edward sent word that he would not kill his mother, but by then it made no difference to her. She was quite mad, pacing the castle, screaming, banging her head against the walls, blocking her ears against the sound of the men she thought had come to kill her. Queen Isabella lived another 15 years in her torment, withered, bald, hobbling barefoot about the castle, howling and screaming, and afterwards her ghost paced the castle in her place, her screams echoing throughout the night. This was the ghost which Harold Collins was waiting for, with his tape recorder and infrared goggles. And she visited him too. The following morning, the castle keeper returned to find Harry in the same spot. He was shaking, and in the night his hair had turned snow white. "Did you see her?" asked the keeper. The ghost hunter slowly turned her head to look at the keeper with haunted eyes. He opened his mouth and began to scream and scream and scream. Since that day, the doors of Rising Castle have been kept firmly locked at night. Harold Collins lived out his days in an asylum, still screaming.